Good morning to those of you coming in early. We appreciate your punctuality, and we're just going to give it a minute or two for folks to enter and get started. Thanks for joining us. Okay, we're right at the top of the hour, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our webinar to share the results of Connected West, our recently released transmission study for the West. My name is Kathy Boyce, and I am Director for the Interior West at GridWorks. We are a nonprofit organization that provides stakeholder engagement services, policy advice, and technical assistance to decision makers and stakeholders working on challenging energy conversations in the West. I want to briefly recognize my colleagues from Grid Lab, Casey Baker and Rick O'Connell, and from GridWorks, Matthew Tisdale, my boss, who are joining us on the call today. They all have been integral to the study's development, and I want to thank them for their guidance and expertise. And I also want to introduce my coworker, Matt Jones. Matt, if you want to say hi quick, he's helping to keep us running smoothly. So thank you, Matt, for keeping us on track. Before we jump in, a couple organizing thoughts on slide 2 here. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with registrants in a day or two. You can find this presentation and all the study materials on the Connected West website. And if you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will work to fold in your questions into our discussion as we move along today. So our purposes today are twofold. First, to share Connected West study findings, and then secondly, to hear from experts how Connected West relates to transmission planning, cost allocation, and siting initiatives happening in the West. So our study, Connected West, is a study of the transmission needed in the West to ensure reliability, lower costs to meet a high demand future over the next 20 years. It was initiated by Grid Lab and GridWorks about 1.5 years ago, and it provides a comprehensive long-range, high electrification regional assessment of transmission needs. It is the first of its kind, and it was conducted by Energy Strategies. So our intent with this study is to help inform the conversations happening in the West about transmission planning and cost allocation, and also to provide an aggressive scenario to inform other studies. So we do have several speakers and industry experts on the webinar today. Matt, if you want to advance to slide 4. They're going to help us digest Connected West. So we'll first turn to the Energy Strategies team, Keegan Moyer and John Moose, to help explain the study findings. And then at the top of the hour, I will ask our industry experts to join us to give us their perspectives on Connected West and how it relates to other transmission planning and cost allocation activities happening in the West. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Keegan and John. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Pleased to be here today, taking some time to present this study that we're excited about. Energy Strategies has worked on this for well over 1 year at this point. So for those of you that may not be familiar with our firm, we're a consultancy based in Salt Lake City, but with employees across the country. We work in the electric and natural gas space for utilities, power producers, transmission companies, governmental agencies, and nonprofits and NGOs like GridWorks and Grid Lab. So we appreciate them and the chance to do this study, and are excited to be here today to present our work. So if you can go to the next slide. The purpose of this slide is really to just emphasize that it's not just our work. So first of all, John and I have been joined by a large team of experts at Energy Strategies that we're really thankful for their participation in this. Also want to recognize Emily Leslie from Montara Mountain Energy, which is a partner on this, as well as Evolved Energy Research, who shared a lot of data and information helping to make this study possible. Finally, I want to thank the Technical Review Committee. Their names are listed here. They met several times with us throughout this project, really diverse backgrounds, and helped us make better assumptions, develop better methodologies, and end up in a better place as far as the study outcomes are concerned. So we're thankful for their time and contributions. I'll go to the next slide. So this is the agenda today. John and I are going to take 45 minutes or so and summarize the study for you. I'm going to cover some background on the study, motivation and purpose. Why did we do this work, and kind of why did we make some of the key assumptions we did? What are some of the outcomes and questions we were trying to answer? John's going to spend the majority of his time speaking about the study methodology, the details of how we did it and the assumptions, and then we'll wrap up the last 20 minutes or so covering the key findings, what we learned from this work. A couple of things I want to emphasize here is that this deck, this slide deck that we're showing you today is one of several versions of materials that document the study itself. There's a written report that's available. I think Matt has already put the URL in there, but you also find several slides in this deck are really better intended to be reviewed and read later. So know that John and I will move through some of these materials rather quickly, do our best to provide a layman's view of really what we did and why. But for those of you that want to go into the details, we are not going to be able to cover all those today, but there's a lot of written words here and a pretty robust report that backs all this up and should provide the documentation that you're interested in. With that, I think we will be able to jump into the context or the rest of the slides. So go forward, Matthew, or Matt, and then so I'll start here with a little bit on the motivation for this work. So this work stemmed out of several parallel conversations that were had between, I think, GridWorks and Grid Lab and Energy Strategies, and really some shared views about transmission needs, long-term planning needs, and particularly those two issues in the context of the Western grid, which was the focus of this study. So first of all, we all had the shared view that there were some pretty significant regional planning gaps. This was really supported by the fact that outside of the CAISO, none of the Order 1000 regional planning areas were really identifying new transmission upgrades. Certainly regional scale projects were being built, but those were generally projects that had been in development for 10 plus years, right? So we weren't really sourcing any new ideas or concepts out of those planning processes. That also was kind of the lack of transmission expansion was also apparent in the fragmented nature the grid was being built. For those investments that we were building out, many of those investments were within a single transmission owner system. So we have been investing in the grid the last 10 or 15 years, but for the most part, most of those investments are within a given transmission area, very rarely between areas. One reason for this is that Order 1000 and other planning processes that we use to plan our transmission grid really don't have a method or a framework to identify new interregional upgrades, right? So, and on top of all this, there's many federal initiatives looking at, new Department of Energy transmission corridors that we thought that needed some information to help to prioritize and understand how those could be used. So with all that as background, we thought that there was a need to really address some of these concerns by performing a study that would provide a Western specific, really bookend view of potential transmission expansion needs over the approaching 20 years. And we did that from a bookend perspective by adopting a scenario likely to produce an aggressive transmission build. And that was one that was a future that was highly decarbonized with significant electrification of load, that would really envision a Western economy that would be reliant on a transmission system that kind of was yet to be planned. So what we did as a part of this study was really create information, right? This is not a transmission plan with a capital P, it's not a construction plan, but we wanted to create information about this future through generating information that you see here in these bullets. So we wanted to produce information for 3 different sets of transmission portfolios using different types of transmission technologies that all met the needs of this same future. That way we can begin to understand some of their trade-offs. We also wanted to capture a broad set of transmission benefits so we can understand what we're likely to get out of a dollar spent in transmission investment in returns in terms of savings that would accrue from that. We also wanted to consider a wide range of both generation and transmission technologies, and also include a robust geospatial analysis around what transmission corridors may be utilized to enable this future. So there's some details here shown on the right side that really highlight some of the key attributes of the study. I don't have time to go through all these right now, but it's a 20-year assessment focused on the WECC grid, a very detailed assessment with a nodal topology. So we're modeling every transformer and line on the system. We have kind of utility grade models looking at both reliability and economics, and a very, I think, thoughtful approach into what this future needs, right, from a resource build out and a demand perspective. So with that in mind, go to the next slide, and I'll talk briefly about one of the key inputs into the study, which was a study called Power Place. So to do a transmission study, it's necessary to have a forecast of generation and demand out into the future. As we start doing 20-year transmission planning analyses, that gets quite difficult. There's very few, utility-based trajectories that go out that far. So what this study did is it built on a recent assessment commissioned by the Nature Conservancy, performed by Evolved Energy Research, called the Power Place West. This study effort was unique because it looked at economy-wide kind of energy and transmission expansion for a future that was highly decarbonized, by also considering the conservation goals, right? So it really took a lot of flashpoint issues, conservation, decarbonization, the need to look at the entire economy and really optimize them all together. So this is a very useful study that captures a lot of unique trade-offs between the energy sector, the transportation sector, the residential community, commercial and industrial groups, and gives us, the transmission planners, a view of this kind of optimal load and resource expansion. What the study did not do was do a detailed transmission study. So what is double down on that transmission analysis with this feeding really as an input. Go to the next slide. So this slide is here to show you what Connected West future really looks like. So on the right side, I show you those 2 key inputs, demand and generation capacity. And this is benchmarked against this WECC ADS. So it's the anchor data set. So for those of you not familiar, this is sort of a typical utility-based 10-year forecast developed by WECC, right? And that goes out 10 years. So what we're doing here is showing you how different this Connected West 20-year future is from that 10-year future. So obviously significantly more load, right? We've got about 100 gigawatts of more demand by 2045, and a generation fleet that practically doubles up to 750 gigawatts by 2045. So what we're doing is trying to look at transmission needs associated with this future. And we do that by developing transmission portfolios. So not single projects, right? Because a single project isn't going to meet the needs of this future. We're looking at a portfolio of projects. And specifically in this study, we are focused on what we call next generation transmission investments. So you're probably aware that there's a lot of planned infrastructure that's in flight, so to speak, from a transmission standpoint. And rather than picking and choosing winners or trying to forecast which exact of those lines were going to be built, this study effectively assumes that roughly $30 billion of transmission investment occur. And we wanted to understand, well, what else is needed? What don't we have planned yet that we may need by 2045 that could take 15 years to, plan for and optimized and consider? So that is the way that this study is oriented, which is quite different from many other planning studies. So in doing that, we looked at a range of transmission solutions and configurations. We assessed their technical performance, looked at their benefits, their costs, looked at how much land they used, and their development feasibility. So the outcome of all this is, again, information. So our goal is to have this work serve as a resource to other planners, other planning processes. This is a complementary scenario-based approach to transmission planning. So it would be useful to other planning processes that are underway now, such as WESTEC, and would be underway in the future, such as those that would take place under Order 1920. We hope all those efforts can take what we've learned here in terms of the outcomes and the methods and build from this and move the ball further down the field. Let's go to the next slide. So the last few slides, you're going to see these questions again. So these were the key questions that really dictated to us how we designed and structured the study. So the first question that we wanted to answer through this work is to really understand the capabilities of this $30 billion of planned projects. We did not know if that was going to be enough investment or not by 2045. So first of all, we wanted to understand how far do those planned projects get us towards meeting the needs of this 2045 electrified and decarbonized system. Second question, pretty obvious. Assuming they don't meet the needs of that system, how much more transmission capacity do we need? How much more transmission investment do we need? How large is this gap? Then when we start to look at the results of those portfolios and how that gap was filled, we can look at, okay, are there any common corridors? Where did those transmission investments fall? And then finally, a fourth question is, so we probably need some new greenfield transmission. How does that level of investment compare with maybe techniques that might leverage our existing infrastructure, such as rebuilding or reconductoring transmission lines? So these are the main motivations of the study. Go to the next slide, and I will end my narrative here, at least for now, with a very important summary of the scope of this work. I think with transmission planning, especially planning that we're going to put out these investment numbers and what's needed, it is critical that the audience understand what we looked at, what we focused on, and what we didn't focus on. We think this is a important slide. And so I'm going to walk through this really quickly and first recognize that all studies have to do this, right? We cannot do an entire West-wide planning approach and plan every line from the power plant to the transformer outside of your house, in an accurate way through a study like this. We have to define a scope that we're going to focus on. So given this macro West-wide study, we had to limit our analyses. And what we focused primarily on was basically high voltage or extra high voltage transmission that was above 300 kV and transmission lines that might have been slightly lower voltage that were used to connect states and balancing areas. We also selected some other regionally significant lines depending on the local topology. So that's the focus of this study. What we don't capture are lower voltage upgrades, generation tie lines, intra-area transmission upgrades that don't meet those criteria that I just went over. Those are all examples of transmission infrastructure that the study does not develop a expansion plan for. So what does that mean in terms of the results? It means that what you're going to see is a expansion plan that is really a floor in terms of investment, right? So it's not a comprehensive forecast of investment. It is investment that's reasonable for the scope that we've laid out. So that's the last thing that I'm going to speak to, and I'm going to hand it over to John, and he's going to talk through some of the methods and key assumptions that we adopted. Let's go ahead, John.
All right, thank you, Keegan. So I'll take the next 15 minutes or so and walk us through the study methods and then a couple of the the findings from the study, and then I'll pass it back over to Keegan for the last 10 or 15 minutes. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So Keegan already mentioned, a lot of the high-level features of our study, but it's important to also understand kind of the process that our team took to develop the transmission portfolios that we identify as part of this study. So the first step in that is understanding the where we started, which is the 2045 Connected West reference case. As Keegan mentioned earlier, we started with an 2032 ADS, which is a kind of a typical forward-looking 10-year view of the system, and we expanded that case to represent a 2045 future consistent with the power of Place West. We already took a look at, importantly, the generation growth and load growth that was assumed in that expansion. But then notably, we kind of took a slightly different track for transmission. In transmission for the reference case, we assumed a series of lines are already built by 2045. And Matt, if you could go to slide 15, I'd like to just show those briefly. Slide 19 there. So the system represented 2045 in terms of generation and load, and it included these lines kind of baked into the case. So these were assumed built by 2045. So you'll probably notice, be familiar with a good number of these lines already in development across the West. These are assumed to get built by 2045. And if you could go back up to the first slide, Matt, thank you. What we did was we developed this 2045 case, and then we ran it and used the results to identify areas for that experienced the need for additional transmission. So we used a series of metrics to identify locations on the Western grid where transmission could help balance out LMPs across the system or reduce congestion. And then we used a iterative process using both production cost modeling and power flow to develop and route and assess transmission portfolios, so solutions that meet the needs of the systems. And then we have a benefit framework by which we assessed and compare the transmission portfolios that we developed for the study. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'll take us through some of the more detailed assumptions of some of this. We started with the WEC 2032 ADS. This was a production cost model run in GridView that models an entire year of operations and finding the least cost dispatch. And we took this case and expanded it to represent 2045. And so you'll see, some of the key assumptions that were made for our reference case in this table here. Next slide. One of the key assumptions there was load. And so this slide gives us a view of kind of what we assumed for load. Again, the loads in this study, in this reference case, were taken to emulate the power of Place West, which is a kind of economy-wide decarbonization. And so therefore, you notice that not only the magnitude of load grows in between now and 2045, you see that it's, in this, we're showing the load growth trajectory to 2032, consistent with the ADS, and then how load would grow beyond that time frame to reach 2045. And overall, from today through 2045, the study models a West-wide load growth rate of about 2.5% compound annual growth rate. So there's a significant amount of load growth, as well as the shape of load changes also fairly significantly. As was shown on the previous slide, we show there are a number of technologies that are included in the loads in this study, including fuel production using renewable energy, things like that, that changed the nature, the time of loads across the system. And so it represents kind of that post economy-wide load from Power of Place West. This slide shows on the resource side where we injected additional generation. And so this shows at a bus level with the transmission system in the background, roughly where we added different forms of generation on the system. The goal that we set out to achieve with this was, again, to be consistent with Power of Place West, and just in order to capture their siting considerations, which were, consider environmental and working land considerations. And so what we did was we found bus locations where these proposed power plants could be added to the system near their project locations in the Power of Place West. And we made sure that on a state-by-state basis that we're capturing the resource, that the total capacity in 2045 by resource type is consistent with Power of Place West. As we mentioned earlier, this slide shows the transmission expansion that was assumed in the 2045 reference case. Notably, this kind of set of lines totals to about 5,900 line miles and $30 billion of investment. So we'll see those numbers later on when we look at the findings. So I just want to point to those now. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we used we set up the reference case as I've described, and we ran it to identify areas where transmission could be used to serve the needs of the system. There were 3 key metrics that we used as an output from the reference case to identify areas where transmission was needed. And those metrics were locational marginal prices, looking at the price of power across the system and how it changes based on losses and congestion, renewable energy curtailment, identifying areas where renewables on the system are unable to be delivered to load due to transmission limitations. And that's what the graphic on the right shows. And then finally, noting that the production cost model that we used is a nodal model, meaning it is modeling individual branches and buses on the system. And so we used the results of congestion and flows on those elements to identify these areas for further transmission solutioning. The graphic on this slide shows the kind of iterative process that our team took to identify transmission solutions. So once we had identified areas with a specific need, we took that area and modeled it in PowerFlow, and we performed a deliverability study in PowerFlow that looked at more detailed voltage issues and thermal overloads and things like that for the system. And we used those PowerFlow cases to develop transmission solutions that mitigated those issues. We then took those solutions, plugged them into this economic production cost model to see how they act over a wider range of operating hours. And then we iterated that process until a set of key transmission needs metrics were satisfied. This slide shows a little bit more detail on how we performed that PowerFlow deliverability methodology. We split the WEC system up into 11 subzones and evaluated each of those subzones under a stressed off-peak condition. The PowerFlow study and the transmission solutions that we identified really seeked, as Keegan mentioned, we didn't focus on intra area, but more focused on power delivery between regions and on the edges of these 11 regions here. So that was kind of the focus of the transmission solutions that we identified. And we, again, we took these solutions, tested them iteratively in the production cost model until, you know, a bulk of the issues that we saw were met. Once we use that process to develop basically point-to-point solutions. So we say we need a line upgrade from substation A to substation B, but that still doesn't necessarily translate into real-world, you know, corridors and transmission lines. And so we partnered with Emily Leslie at Montara Mountain Energy, who used a GIS tool to perform an optimal cost path routing. Basically, for those conductor routes that we needed, we gave her 2 points, and she had a GIS tool that identified a least cost path between them, given a whole host of considerations, including terrain, land type, and the ability to use existing transmission rights of way. That tool also helped us inform part of the transmission costs, which we assumed. And so we took her routes and assumed a $1 per mile cost associated with that. And there were adders in there to account for some of the routing, you know, considerations. And then we plugged that into a broader transmission cost calculation that included not only those routed costs, but the cost of other system upgrades as well. The cost figures from this study were sourced from a combination of sources, including MISO MTEP and WEC TEPC cost calculators. Consistent with FERC Order 1920, this study had a multi-transmission benefit framework. So we for this study had 7 benefit categories, most of which will probably be familiar to some of you who are in the transmission planning world. And we assessed the entire transmission portfolio benefits together. So this is several lines together, comparing with and without these lines. So a couple of the notable benefits that kind of drive results in this study are the operational savings. So this is simply efficiencies in commitment and dispatch in serving load. Another notable one is this fourth one, the capacity savings. So basically the value of avoided capacity by having a more connected system. In addition to those 2 main ones, we also assessed a whole host of other benefit categories, including extreme event mitigation and other things like that. All of these, the costs that I mentioned on the previous slide, all of the benefits that we show here were wrapped up into a net benefit calculation. Next slide, please. And those net benefits were the primary metric that were used to compare transmission portfolios in the Connected West study. So that was a 40-year net present value calculation that we did. And then additionally, you'll see a lot of this other detail in the report. We also assessed the various transmission portfolios along a whole other set of lines, factors, including land impacts, wildfire risk, new rights of way, things like that. So that is our methodology at a glance, and I'll go ahead and introduce the 3 portfolios and then get into some of our key findings. So we have maps on this slide to introduce kind of the key transmission assumptions and results in this study. So that slide that I showed earlier that had that list of transmission that was assumed baked into the reference case is shown here on the upper left-hand corner. So those kind of dark brown lines that you see there are the lines that we assume are you know, in development today or likely to be built, and are assumed in this study to be built by 2045. On top of that are the other 3 transmission portfolios that we identified as part of the study process. So those are the results, the outcome of the study. The first is the AC overlay portfolio. This is a transmission portfolio that met the needs of the system with conventional conductoring technologies. The next is the HVDC portfolio. This portfolio seeks to connect areas with low LMPs and a surplus of generation to areas with higher LMPs and a need for low-cost power via HVDC lines. And there's also a good amount of underlying AC transmission included in this portfolio that is used to get power, from the areas where it's generated up onto those lines. And then the advanced conductor portfolio is an augmentation of the AC overlay portfolio, in which we included and used advanced conductoring in place of conventional transmission conductoring where fitting. And so we didn't optimize the implementation of advanced conductors in this scenario, but rather just kind of incorporated them into our portfolio as we met transmission needs. So those typically are conductors that have higher capacities than conventional conductors. Next slide, please. All right, I'll take us through a couple of the key findings and then pass it back to Keegan. So now that's our methodology. Those are the portfolios at a high level. And now we'll talk about some of the analysis and that we use to inform the findings of our study. So as Keegan mentioned earlier, when we started this study, we didn't know what the outcome would be. We didn't know if the set of lines that we assumed get built in the reference case would solve a majority of the needs of the system in 2045. But what our study found is that they did not. So to support an electrified and highly decarbonized Western grid in 2045, additional transmission expansion beyond what is currently planned is required. And to get a sense of the magnitude of that, I'll point us to the bottom right-hand slide. There's a graph that says new line miles there. And that shows the kind of the relative transmission gap and how it's met by planned lines, those 5,900 line miles that we assume get built, and then the remaining gap in each of our 3 portfolios. And so what you'll notice looking at that graph is that the total need is just over 20,000 line miles, and about 5,900 of that is are planned today. And so the planned lines get us about 25% to where we need to be for the transmission system in 2045 to be able to accommodate this future. If we look at the gap there in terms of capital investment, I'm now on the bottom bullet. We see that the planned lines total about a $30 billion capital investment. And for the AC portfolio, we identified about a $75 billion of further capital investment. So that brings us to about $100 billion over the approaching 20 years. Next slide, please. So just to put this in context, we created a graphic that shows the size of these upgrades relative to the existing transmission system. So notably, I'll point us first to the big gray box. That is the existing 200 kV transmission system in the West is about 100,000 line miles of transmission. The upgrades that we identified that could be expansions within existing corridors was a majority of our AC portfolio at about 13,200 miles. And then on top of that, there's 5,900 miles of planned transmission. And then the final piece of this is new transmission corridors, which is a fairly small amount of the transmission portfolios that we identified. Keeping in mind that the solutions that we're identifying here are in the scope that Keegan mentioned, which is typically 300 kV or above, with a slightly lower threshold between states and regions. So this graphic helps kind of put all of that in perspective. Next slide, please. So now we're taking a look at, again, how much of our portfolios were identified as being able to be reconductored or upgrades within existing corridors. As you probably guessed from the previous slide, a majority of the line miles that our portfolios identified were able to be met via reconductoring and co-locating of lines. And so the map on the upper right-hand side of this graph, the yellow and green lines on that map show the areas where there were common co-located lines or reconductored lines across the Western system. So you'll see, a pretty wide geographic distribution of areas where, we were able to reconductor or co-locate lines. And again, that equals about 85% of the line miles in our AC overlay portfolio. However, greenfield transmission can't be avoided in certain cases based on the needs of the system. Again, we're assuming here that load grows, load and generation both grow, pretty significantly over the next 20 or so years. And all of our portfolios identified some amount of greenfield transmission. Our AC portfolio of about that total 15,000, about 2,400 of those line miles required new rights of way. And so we're greenfield, what we're calling as greenfield lines. And the map on the bottom right part of this slide shows those areas where those greenfield lines were required. Notably, those lines connect Colorado and its neighboring states, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. There's a line that connects Arizona and New Mexico. There's a line up in the top part of that connects Montana to the Mid-Sea area in the Pacific Northwest, and then a number of greenfield paths in the in-state California to basically just service load growth and generation in that state. I'll pass the third key finding back to Keegan. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the results from a benefit perspective, and then just some ancillary observations we had on the study. So first of all, this benefits analysis, important to understand that we're looking at the total cost of the portfolio and how that cost would result in a revenue requirement effective of the asset, and then calculating the present value of that cost, and then comparing it to the present value of all the categories of benefits we showed earlier for that same time horizon. So based off that analysis, we get to gross benefit. Those numbers are shown here. These are in millions of dollars. So the gross benefits are on the range of $250 billion plus. And the portfolio costs on a present value basis are between 150 and 200 billion. So that leads us to some net benefits in the range of somewhere between 50 and 100 billion, depending on the portfolio. At the end of the day, all of these portfolios of transmission with the thematically different transmission technologies have comparable and favorable benefit cost ratios of about 1.4. What that means is that effectively for every dollar you invest in this transmission infrastructure, it returns $1.40 in terms of savings. The biggest drivers of these benefits were the increased connectivity between the regions, the load diversity savings that we achieved, some fuel and operational savings and efficiencies that we observed, and also intrinsic kind of economic value in avoiding the cost of extreme events, meaning the damage that those can do to a economy and a community. So that's a very key takeaway from the study, is that we didn't see an outlier, and kind of informed one of our conclusions that it's very likely to be that the optimal transmission plan, which we did not represent these to be optimal, they're intentionally different, but it's likely that the optimal plan would incorporate aspects of all these portfolios. There's certain upgrades that'll be best met with AC solutions, certain upgrades that'll be best met with HVDC solutions, and certain upgrades that advanced conductor technologies would be best suited for. The finding isn't small or irrelevant. We expected that, you know, perhaps one of these portfolios would be an outlier, but we learned that they all perform in some similar ways and have some trade-offs, and ultimately the best path forward is likely to be a mix of them. The other commonality that they all have is they all have very similar capabilities in terms of adding area to area transfer capability to the system, which, from my opening remarks, that was one of the issues that we observed with, that the system probably lacked planning in that area. And based off of the shape and nature and performance of these portfolios, that thesis or hypothesis really proved out in these results, that more area to area connectivity is needed. Go to the next slide and I'll share some additional observations. So one of the things that's clear, so we did this study, you know, at our office here with our team of power system engineers and John and I, right? There's a high degree of coordination, right? That's included in that team that exceeds the level of coordination that occurs in actual utility planning, right? There's different processes. There's local planning processes. There's regional planning processes. Will soon be a long-term regional planning process under Order 1920. None of those processes really have the degree of coordination that we used and therefore assumed in this study. So it's likely, and we feel fairly strongly about this, that less coordination, right, would produce a more expensive transmission build relative to what we identified in this work. And so that's an important caveat, or, you know, adder to any of the findings that you see. Another important finding that we observed is related to grid enhancing technologies. So the advanced high capacity conductors, which were, you know, key in one of the portfolios, made up about 1/3 of the line miles in that portfolio, right? So it was a really key component of that portfolio. What we found is that other grid enhancing technologies, such as dynamic line ratings and power flow controllers, ultimately were not well suited for the needs of this study, because they simply didn't increase the transfer capability in the way that we needed, right? So the way that I've been explaining this to people is that, you know, to the extent you have, you know, a certain need for flow capacity across the area, and if you have to increase that capacity, one, on a short timeline, and two, a marginal amount, we believe strongly that these technologies, these other grid enhancing technologies, are going to be viable options. But when you need twice as much grid capacity, there are very few solutions for that do not include either grid enhancing technologies or other new wires in the air, so to speak, whether they be HVDC or AC. So the reality of the physics is that in some of these cases, when we're looking at the studies like this that go out this far, the demands of the grid are significant enough that simply new wires in some shape or form are needed to ensure reliability and the transfer capability the grid needs. Wanted to make that point. One of the other areas I want to mention is that the resource development assumptions that we use. So we did take a very sophisticated approach to citing where future resource would be located. Some of the prime development areas are in, you know, relatively rural areas of the Western US, you know, out in the rural sections of Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, particularly with wind. In many cases, those areas do not have the backbone transmission necessary, right? They have 115 kV, 230 kV kind of local systems that really weren't built for this purpose, right? So the results of this study, if you kind of look out at the future, 20 years from now, one of the themes we wouldn't be surprised to see is kind of rural transmission expansion and investment into those communities to enable this future is likely going to be required. One of the other observations we have is that, planned transmission helps in a lot of cases, right? So we assumed $30 billion of investment before we started even looking at what else was needed. And what we found is that in a lot of areas where that transmission is taking place now, literally with shovels in the ground today, that helps, right? That helps move those areas towards meeting the needs of these 20-year futures. And it's important not to forget that a lot of utilities right now are taking steps towards that. So a good example is in Nevada with the Greenlink complex, which is a fairly comprehensive build out in that state. We saw relatively less transmission expansion in this 20-year study in that area. And a big part of that is because of what's already underway in that state. However, there's some areas where there's a lot of transmission being built and it's simply not enough. So good examples of that would be Wyoming and California, where there's major steps forward in terms of grid expansion, but simply due to the volume of resource deployment in California and the location of some of the wind that we added in Wyoming, even though they built out their grids significantly, that build out's likely going to need to continue out into the future. A final note on cost, right? So in an important view, of course, we did the cost benefit analysis, but there is this concept of the impact that these costs would have on rates. We did not do a detailed analysis on that as a part of this study, but an important perspective is that, the energy content that we see on the system effectively doubles from what it is today. So it's what we just caution readers here is it's an inaccurate conclusion to basically look at this investment in transmission and basically say these customers we have today are going to have to pay for this. That's not the right perspective. The right perspective is that if under this future we have to have this level of transmission investment, there's an entire turnover of the economy through electrification, through potentially, new data centers, right? There's new customers that are expecting to have to pay something, right? They're not expecting the current customers to pay for the grid. So we just add that caveat that it's important to know that the load is not static over time. We have new loads coming, and that's really a big driver of the transmission. So it follows that some of those loads would be accountable in terms of the costs associated with this build out. So I believe that that is the end of our prepared remarks. So I will pass it over to you, Kathy, and thanks for the time to present that formally.
Thank you, Keegan and John. Tremendous work. If I could ask a few questions of you to help crystallize our understanding of the study before we turn to our panel reaction. So Keegan, a lot of questions coming through in the Q&A. If I could ask you to please repeat the key inputs to the study. What assumptions do folks need to understand that frame the study?
I'll let John take that one.
Yeah, so a lot of the key inputs are the fact that we have, a high electrification trajectory for demand growth and resource projections consistent with Power of Place West. So this does more than just represent a magnitude of demand growth. We actually modify the load shapes in the study to capture some of the emerging technologies like fuel production processes, like electrification, that would change the nature in which electricity is consumed over the next 20 years. Again, also the resource locations in this study, developed by Power of Place West, were done with care to consider environmental and land implications. And I think that really helps avoid, in some instances, some of the simplifications that are made in capacity expansion modeling that I've noticed. So it's a much more nuanced and detailed view of the system. So that's demand and generation. And then I'd also say one of the other key assumptions is that we're looking at the next generation of transmission. So we're taking a view of incorporating 5,900 line miles, baking those into our reference case, and then looking out beyond that and identifying the areas and asking what's next and where. So I think those are some of the key inputs to the study.
Thank you. So to follow, distributed energy resources are captured through the demand forecasts?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
they are.
Okay, and I've seen quite a few in the Q&A on generation resource mix, and just to put a fine point on that, using the power of Place West, John, is there any use in identifying resource potential zones like ERCOT of what's in Texas, or do you feel like the study captures that?
I would say that I would refer to the Power of Place West study on that. That they have a much better description of the considerations that went into citing the resources in that study and how they were incorporated here.
I think our view is that the level of detail in defining the amount of potential resources as a part of this study would be superior to something that you might do with drawing a big circle and calling it a zone, right, and putting a number on it. This is much more precise at the substation level. So we think it's a superior approach to defining the resource potential.
Thank you. And along those lines, what would you say is unique about Connected West? Why do we call it the first of its kind?
So a few reasons. The first reason is that at least our firm's not aware of another study to be done like this yet. There certainly will be some in the future, especially with Order 1920 and West Tech, but it's the first effort we think to look at a West-wide 20-year future and do a nodal assessment and develop transmission portfolios in response to that assessment. We had to create a lot of new methods and make a number of assumptions to do that. No doubt those will be improved over time through those other efforts, but for that reason, we think it's the first of its kind. We also are really excited about moving the ball forward with the geospatial analysis that we did in terms of routing. And we think ultimately, as that continues to improve, making a lot of these lines more actionable. I think it's very hard for readers of these reports to assess the viability of some of these solutions without really knowing where they're going to go and what they're going to look at. So, said differently, a straight line drawn with a highlighter on a map is useful for discussions, but it might not be used for moving that forward as a proposal. And so we're happy with the research and the collaboration with Montara Mountain Energy, and we'll continue to work with Emily on that. And then finally, we saw this as one of the initial attempts to emulate a lot of what Order 1920 requires from a benefits methodology perspective, and really put it out there into the open, show our methods and show the approach we took. We think there'll be a lot of that in the future, but this is the first that we've seen, at least in the West.
Thank you. Let's keep going. What could be misunderstood that you want to be sure is clear?
Yeah, I'll take this one. The first thing, and probably most important thing, is that when looking out into the future 20 years, it's important to recognize that this study's a single future, a single kind of scenario, and that a good approach to take is to explore kind of a range of future scenarios. So this is just one. This is a starting point with particular assumptions, and it's important that transmission builds are sensitive to many of the assumptions in this study, resource locations being one of them. So that's probably the first thing. And then the second thing I would just highlight was the what transmission was in scope versus out of scope for this study. I think that's, as Keegan mentioned, that's an important thing to take into account when reviewing this work and comparing our outcomes to other studies.
And if I could ask you to reiterate, what transmission at what level was considered in scope?
Yeah, so 300 kV across the system, across the WEC system, and then 200 kV or higher for anything that connected balancing authorities or to different states.
Okay, so interregional lines across jurisdictions. And just lastly, to help our listeners understand and maybe do a little comparing here, turning to some current events. Late last week, the Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Lab released the National Transmission Planning Study. Keegan and John, what is your initial reaction to the release, and how do the findings compare to what Connected West is telling us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have any reactions other than there's a lot of information to digest, but you know, we can share a little few thoughts on what we have been able to digest in the time that since the National Transmission Planning Study has come out. First of all, we think that the studies have a lot of similarities, at least in one of the scenarios. The National Transmission Study also focuses on a deep decarbonization scenario by 2050 as one of its futures that it considered. So in that way, there's certainly some overlap. There's also some consistencies in terms of the benefit cost ratios that we arrived at versus what the DOE arrived at. I think the methods might have been entirely different. I haven't been able to parse that out yet, but I think the outcomes in terms of dollar invested and dollar returned in savings are comparable. And I also think that, you know, both studies are very similar in their focus on interregional upgrades and the needs in that area, and also planning coordination being a really key factor going forward. I think there's a number of differences that we probably don't have time to get into today, Kathy, but those are some areas where I've observed some overlap between the two.
Thank you. Before I let you go, I'm going to just address one more question that came through in the Q&A here. The impact on emissions. What are the greenhouse gas assumptions, the clean energy path that Connected West is predicated on?
Yeah, so
Okay.
I can talk about that real quick. We of course, so the Power Place West study is a future with a net zero emission goal by 2050. We're modeling 2045, so just before that. In our reference case, we captured a 92% clean energy penetration across the system, and I'd have to look up other portfolios. Let's see.
Thank you. And I think, again, to the audience listening in, presentation is available on the website. So you might also search through there and find some of the specific numbers that you're looking for. Keegan and John, thank you so very much. We really appreciate the work and the comprehensive and really first of its kind. At this point, I'm going to turn to our panel reaction, and I invite our experts to turn on their cameras. We'll do some introductions. We have invited these four because of their work on transmission planning in the West, and they can help us put Connected West findings into context. So I am thrilled to welcome Senator Greg Brophy, Chair Megan Decker, Sarah Edmonds, and Rich Glick. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. So to start, in our last half hour that we have together, if I may please ask you to introduce yourself, your organization, and your connection to this work, transmission planning, cost allocation, and siting. And I'm going to ask you to go in alphabetical order. So Senator Brophy, if you would start, please.
Good morning, I'm Greg Brophy. I'm with Western Way, the Colorado State Director. I'm a farmer from Northeast Colorado, a former state senator, and I've worked for the last 8 years helping to get siting permits for transmission in both for private and public companies in Colorado.
Thank you. Chair Decker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Decker, and I've been serving as the chair of the Oregon Public Utility Commission for quite a few years now. And I've also been a participant in various regional transmission planning forums as a state representative. I'm certainly connected to transmission as a state regulator, and also through my regional work as a proponent of meaningful dialogue among the West's diverse states and provinces. And to that end, I've been helping to lead a state transmission collaborative within the West's Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, or CREPC.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome. Sarah?
Good morning, good afternoon. Sarah Edmonds, President and CEO of Western Power Pool, and I'm connected through this work, through the things that Western Power Pool is doing and will be doing to advance transition perspectives across the Western interconnection. Western Power Pool has for a number of years been facilitating and supporting the regional planning that's conducted by member transmission provider and owners of Northern Grid. And also, since last year, we are the sponsors and facilitators of a West-wide 20-year transmission study effort called WestTech, or the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, that's just now beginning its work on the next 2.5 years to produce a 10 and 20-year transmission study, which we'll talk about a little bit more.
Thank you. We look forward to it. And Rich?
Hey, I'm Rich Glick. I'm with GQS New Energy Strategies, but also a senior fellow with GridWorks. And I used to be with FERC. I used to be the chairman of FERC. And during my tenure there, we were heavily involved in what eventually became Order 1920 in terms of we actually issued a proposed rulemaking that it ended up becoming Order 1920, focusing on transmission planning and cost allocation. In addition to that, I work with primarily with GridWorks, helping to facilitate some work with the CREPC Transmission Cooperative that Chair Decker mentioned, and doing some other work also with WestTech.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So to start, I'm going to read to you GridWorks and GridLab's bottom line statement, summing up the Connected West work. And then I'll ask each of you, what about this statement resonates and where do you have questions? So the bottom line statement: the West can achieve its goal of a reliable grid to support a strong economy at a manageable cost if we work together to plan and build the transmission we need. If we do not, we will have a more expensive grid. So what about this statement resonates for you, and where do you have questions? Sarah, you want to kick us off?
Sure, happy to. There's a lot there that resonates with me, and I think all of the regional partners that are supporting the WestTech effort. That's really one of the drivers that brought us together, which is we need a broad coalition effort, really led by industry. And when I say industry, I mean all of the regional partner stakeholders that have a vested interest in our energy future, whatever that may look like for them. And there are different perspectives and views about what that energy future should look like. And I think the key with Connected West or WestTech is being able to recognize your own potential future in that study output. That's a real key to the success of these efforts. And so there's a lot there that resonates. I think WestTech is trying to take a deeper step towards a broader collaboration. And we can talk in a little bit about what that looks like over in WestTech world, observing, of course, that Connected West is much farther along. You're at the end of the process, and we're really just starting the process. So really hoping that what we're building with Connected West, and there's a lot of overlap, can help us in the WestTech environment.
I'll open it up here. What about the bottom line statement resonates for our other speakers?
Well, I think what Sarah said is spot on. We need to be thinking ahead, not just by individual utilities, but across the entire Western grid, to make sure that we have a plan for the future and that we are indeed executing that plan by working together, that cooperative nature that she mentioned.
Chair Decker, from your vantage point, that planning across the entire Western grid, given the forms that you're working in, how is that going?
Well, I guess what resonates for me initially as a state regulator is just that a planned approach to connecting diverse load and resource zones efficiently should be less expensive overall than a bottoms-up piecemeal approach, especially if we can find that broad support for transmission expansion. I mean, as a regulator facing a lot of near-term cost reality in rate cases. I'm really motivated toward institutional framework changes that promise to drive down overall costs. I do have some questions in those areas of costs and about whether we can get to that shared Western vision of the transmission we need. I can talk about those a little more, but generally the resonance is with the promise of really using coordination to drive down costs, because we need that.
Thank you. Rich, reactions of what resonates?
Yeah, I wanted to focus on, I think I agree with everything everybody said so far. I wanted to focus on the benefits of just planning in general, right? So transmission planning, one of the things I think at FERC that we found is that, there was a requirement for regional transmission planning instituted by Order 1000 a little over 10 years ago. And it didn't work out necessarily as intended, in large part because the planning approaches that were taken weren't necessarily comprehensive enough, weren't necessarily long-term enough, not anticipatory enough in terms of looking where, we need to know where the demand is, what's the demand going to be, where's the supply going to be, what are the various factors that are going to affect the electric system in various regions. And I think the real, I guess the real lesson that was learned by FERC over the last several years is that if you don't have sufficient planning, you're going to choose the wrong lines. You're going to choose the more expensive lines. You're going to be less efficient, and the worst of all, you're going to lead to a grid that's moving forward in a piecemeal basis and not necessarily in the most reliable and resilient manner. And so the key is to have a sufficient and efficient planning process, and I think Connected West shows that.
So let's focus in on this working together and developing a shared vision. As we heard from Keegan and John, a key assumption in the Connected West study is a high level of coordination and regional cooperation. So Chair Decker, back to you. Is this realistic? What more needs to be done?
A lot more. Regional cooperation in this area to me means getting really diverse perspectives engaged together in rigorous analysis towards some kind of high value transmission backbone that serves everyone. And I think we're advancing toward that regional cooperation through this study, because as well as I understand it, it really is that rigorous, comprehensive, serious analysis that advances the methodology, not just for the economic and reliability analysis, but also going toward that macro land corridor type analysis. But I think we have to be clear that Connected West, it can't and isn't trying to represent a vision that's going to be shared by all states in the West. It intentionally and explicitly establishes a bookend of a net zero renewables heavy vision of the future. And that embeds its results in a certain specific desired outcome, which might skew some assumptions and probably undermines, its results in some parts of the West, just being honest. I really resonate with the questions that are sort of like, let me take this study and what happens if you do this instead, or what happens if you do that instead? Like there's a lot more scenario development that needs to happen. Even still, I think there's something here for everyone who's interested in regional cooperation around transmission to take away and learn. You see load growth here in the form of transportation and building electrification. And since this study started, we've come to a very different conversation about what large loads are likely to do in the West. And maybe we're arriving at the same place for different reasons, right? It's important to use this serious work that has been done and not sort of look away from it because it represents a certain vision of the West. I'm really grateful to have this and the National Transmission Planning Study coming in just as West Tech is beginning its scenario development, so that people can engage and query what's missing in this vision and figure out how to use the baseline that it creates to help work toward making the most broadly meaningful version of the West Tech study and some of the other studies that are coming. So that's my perspective on how this relates to regional cooperation. It's a start.
A start. Thank you. So turning back to Rich, and you referenced this of Order 1000 and some of the shortcomings. Of course, long-range comprehensive regional planning is the key decision point coming out of FERC Order 1920, and those conversations are underway and with compliance filings expected here in the near future. So Rich, how do you see Connected West fitting into the 1920 discussions that are happening? And can the study help make these discussions more productive?
Well, one thing, and this isn't just an issue in the West, I think there's a common understanding, I think, throughout the United States that we need significant amounts of additional transmission capacity to address growing concerns about reliability and resilience, load growth, which is happening at record paces all across the country, concerns about extreme weather. All those issues and the changing resource mix, of course, are all necessitate the need to build additional transmission capacity around the country. Now, and I think that's where, this is what I find interesting about the Connected West study. I think it really makes, if you look at the maps, it really makes the case pretty well that you can't do what we used to do in this country, is really plan transmission or plan and build transmission on a utility by utility basis. I think you have to connect various regions, you have to connect, you have to build transmission capacity in many cases that are going to traverse several utility service areas, and that's going to require a significant amount of additional planning, but a significant amount of additional efforts to figure out how to share costs. And there's a whole variety of issues that come up with it. Order 1920 tries to address some of that by requiring, as I mentioned earlier, 20-year transmission planning. You have to have you have to have at least three scenarios to utilize in that transmission planning, and then update those scenarios every 5 years. And that's where, again, I think Connected West shows, if you look at the whole study itself, which really is, to me, it could work into one particular scenario that the regional transmission planners in the West, admittedly there's three transmission planning regions, but I think they can take a lot of that from the Connected West study and utilize it as one of the scenarios, high electrification, a significant amount of reduced greenhouse gas emissions. That certainly, I think, is certainly going to be one of the scenarios that various regions of the country look at. Secondly, Connected West focuses a lot on advanced conductoring and some other grid enhancing technologies. And FERC does require that on the transmission planning processes going forward, a significant effort be made to take a look at these grid enhancing technologies. And I think, again, Connected West, I think, outlines some of the technology, especially on the advanced conductoring side, that planners might be able to use going forward.
Thank you. So bringing in those broader perspectives and the diversity in the Western Interconnect. Sarah, I'm going to turn to you. We've heard of West Tech that's underway, and I know a step or two behind where Connected West is currently. Do you see Connected West having a role in the work that is being undertaken for West Tech?
Yeah, I recall that about a year ago, I was on a panel with Keegan and some others trying to make sense of all the transmission study work that we knew was coming our way. And that included Connected West and the DOE national needs, and then this idea for West Tech. And our goal back then was, let's not create multiple narratives and potential for confusion. Let's try to find a way through this where each element of this journey that we're on with transmission study analysis, a lot more than we've ever seen, is really building on one another and providing sort of a complementary set of building blocks to a common endpoint. And I think that's the path we're on. I feel that West Tech is well positioned with Connected West for it to all be very complementary with one another. As Chair Decker rightly said, this is one vision of an energy future. West Tech is at the beginning stages of developing what its reference case should look like, what should inform its scenarios. West Tech has a much broader set of regional partners coming around the table to inform those decisions. And so the potential to use Connected West and the learnings that we get from that study to build on and to improve, or to maybe improve the trust factor that we hope to get out of the West Tech result, is really right there for the opportunity for the taking. So I'm excited about that. I think there's a lot we can build on with one another. There's plenty of overlap. So Energy Strategies is also the independent consultant that we're using for West Tech. And I've had many conversations with Keegan about how his firm has had a lot of learnings and developed a lot of new technology from Connected West that we can leverage in the West Tech environment. That is a spirit that I am seeing among all the study hosts, study sponsors, and facilitators, is a desire not to create different narratives, but in fact to create leverageable skill sets and learnings. We've got, again, a really broad coalition that we're building with West Tech. Our hope is we produce something that's got high trust, high confidence factor, and can be actionable. There's a lot of similarities with what Connected West is trying to do. I think there are more potential futures that we could see reflected in West Tech scenarios. So that's something to understand. It's an important differentiator. The technical scope of West Tech is, I think, very naturally evolving and becoming a little bit more technical. There's a more nuanced potential. And this is just part of the evolution of building a study, taking those learnings and applying it to the next phase. There may be a lot more assumed transmission in the Connected West evaluation than what we might see in West Tech. So again, it's an important differentiator. It could have an impact on the results. I think in some ways, depending on how we want to build reference case and scenarios in West Tech, there are even more load futures having to do with data centers or artificial intelligence. I'm sure we'll be exploring those conversations in the West Tech environment. So there's a potential for some differentiation there. But overall, I think these things are complementary. They should help one another. Connected West is looking at a vision for a long-term future. I think West Tech is a little bit more nuts and bolts focused on how do we get a 10-year look and then a 20-year look that could potentially result in, I'll say, nearer term, recognizing that these are still 10 and 20-year environments for transmission. But we're really looking to see, can the study be a solid and trusted foundation for actionable transmission, AKA shovels in the ground, where those transmission solutions make sense for the parts of the region where they will bring benefits.
Thank you. I hear that term a lot, actionable transmission plan. Can you distinguish that for us of where Connected West might address that versus West Tech might be different?
It has a lot of elements to it. It can mean different things for different people. So I'll just hit on a couple of things. Clearly, actionable pertains to the granularity of the technical results. For example, how granular are the benefits and the costs that are identified? The more granular those things can be, the more translatable they are into whether different entities want to partner in that transmission solution, what the consequences of putting forth that solution could mean to those communities. It can also mean who is around that table, who are you building trust with, who are you bringing along in the socialization of the analysis and then the results that that analysis produces. Because again, a big factor here is having transparency and building trust in the region so that if it is desired that these solutions be pursued into construction, meaning actionable, you've got a lot of people around that same table that really understand what went into the study that produced that result, that identified that particular transmission solution, transmission portfolio.
Thank you. So Connected West takes a careful approach to transmission routing, identifying corridors that avoid sensitive land areas. Senator Brophy, what is important to you when thinking about transmission development and land use?
All of that, and three things really came to mind that I wanted to talk about here today. One, we need to have a timely, transparent, and open process when it comes to identifying the corridor and then ultimately siting the transmission line. We clearly need some. Second thing we need is clearly need some regulatory reform when it comes to this, depending a little bit upon the state, but especially at the federal government level. And then third, you got to remember that the difference between what you're compensated as a landowner between a public entity and a private entity is substantially different, and we need to talk a little bit about that. So when it comes to timeliness and transparency and openness, the impacted landowners and communities need to have time to digest not only the news, hey, you're in a corridor, here's how it might impact you, but think about what their long-term plans are. You know, does the farmer or rancher have a plan to build something in that area? Is the municipality that's impacted planning to extend its boundaries out? And how can those people help us if they've been given plenty of time to think about it, with the ultimate micro siting of the transmission corridor when it goes through those impacted communities and across that landowner's place. At the regulatory side, I mean, obviously the federal government needs to address its regulatory issues. I mean, I remember thinking back to Transwest trying to build their transmission line or get the permits to build from Wyoming down into Nevada. Like over a decade, with one federal agency telling them yes and another federal agency telling them no. That's not the way you get things built in a timely and efficient manner. We really need to address that. We need to have a system that gives surety to all of the parties involved, so that you know where you're going with this, you know what it's going to cost. And then when it comes to fair compensation, you know, like the difference between a public entity building across your property, you know, that has eminent domain versus a private entity is the private entity has to earn the right to cross your property. The public entity can basically force their way across. Now, as a farmer, and I'm sure it's the same thing for every other landowner, but as a farmer, you got to remember, I'm going to have to deal with that infrastructure in my field for the rest of my life while getting paid for it one time. So I've got to till around it a couple of times. I've got to plant around it. I've got to spray around it. I've got to ultimately harvest around it. And I'm going to do that every year for the next 50 years when getting paid for it one time. It would be a lot easier from a landowner's perspective to accept this if you were paid an amount that was more than a rounding error in your farm budget. So those are the three things that really stood out to me. Siting for transmission is a hard process that causes a lot of hard feelings. The more open, transparent, and timely we are in doing it, the much better chance we have to have a siting process that causes the least amount of problems for everybody involved.
So I'm going to drill down just for a minute. I am conscious of time, so I'll be careful here. But on the micrositing, Connected West showed that 85% of approximately of the corridors that were identified could be done through existing right-of-way, reconductoring and rebuilding transmission lines. Senator, what is your initial reaction to that? Does that surprise you?
It's not surprising because they're in those locations for a reason. That was the best place to put them at the time. But it's still not as easy as, oh, we'll just do another one in there, because they have to be a certain distance apart, or you have to rebuild them while not turning people off. But for sure, that is the best way to address it, is to go where they already are, because it's a lot easier to accept, oh, I'm going to get another transmission line as opposed to a greenfield development.
Thank you. All right, so some closing thoughts for each of you. And I'm going to come around, I guess we'll do alphabetical order again. What's next for transmission in the West? What are your priority actions, and what would you wish to see from others? Senator Brophy?
I definitely want to see us get started on this, because having worked on siting myself at the micro level for projects, it is hard, it is time consuming, and the sooner you get started on this, the better. When I think about our bright future with electrification and the use of artificial intelligence, we definitely need to get ahead of the curve and not always be trying to piecemeal our way into it. We'd be so much better served.
Thank you. Chair Decker?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go to action too, with the old adage that planning is good, but doing is better. And I was going to say that even before our friends on the Q&A encourage us to talk about action. So planning ideally helps to build the confidence to support action, and good planning is now well underway. But action has to come from transmission providers and merchant developers and everyone that's involved in sort of paving the way for that action. And I'd like to see some more discussion and cooperation on the barriers and hurdles to action, whether it's rate pressure or siting or regulatory uncertainty or what have you. I think, we've got some good planning pieces underway, and let's start talking about the other pieces of this puzzle.
Thank you. Sarah?
I want to thank the folks with Connected West for the partnership and the spirit of engagement we've had with one another. I think there's a lot that we can learn and build on, and I hope that's where we go. You know, I also regret that planning is not necessarily doing, but recognize in Chair Decker's remarks that in a way we are still confidence building in the West. And again, to underscore, not everyone has the same perspective on transmission solutions in the West, particularly, and it is really important to build as broad a coalition as possible. West Tech is going to seek to leverage Connected West and many other valuable sources of information out there in the region as it takes its next important steps forward. Again, building a reference case, developing scenarios. And I would emphasize that all critical minds and perspectives, particularly from states and tribes, are welcome in West Tech. We get a better outcome when we are all around that table. And so I would say, if there's an element of Connected West that resonates or doesn't resonate, please get involved in West Tech. There are many opportunities coming. West Tech is by no means a done deal. We have a lot of work ahead of us. But again, the goal is bringing everyone along, whether or not they share the same vision of transmission solutions and energy future. We really need to understand all of the inputs that will get us our outputs on West Tech. And so I end my remarks with that invitation.
Thank you. And Rich.
Yeah, just quickly. So on West Tech, that's certainly the next big thing, right? And I think people are going to be focused significantly on what comes out of it, both in the 10-year study and the 20-year study, as well as at the same time, the Order 1920 transmission planning processes in the Northern Grid and West Connect and the California ISO in the West will also be going on. But there's one other issue that we've touched on just briefly today, which is obviously the cost, right? And that's a very big issue. Not only how much it's going to cost, and I think there were some estimates in the Connected West study, but maybe even more importantly, who's going to pay those costs, right? That's always you look around the country, it doesn't matter what region you're talking about. That's always the biggest barrier to transmission development, is figuring out how to allocate the cost in a just manner and in a manner that everyone can live with. I think there needs to be additional work. I know CREPC Transmission Collaborative is working on that, and others are as well, trying to figure out what the best approach is in the region, kind of going forward basis, to actually figure out who's going to pay those costs.
Thank you. So in closing, when we began this endeavor to identify the next generation of transmission projects to meet a clean, electrified, reliable future for the West, we braced for both a significant price tag and a vast build-out. Instead, the results of Connected West tell us that a clean, electrified, reliable future for the West is doable if we work together and plan new transmission efficiently. And I'm going to echo the words here from Chair Decker: planning is good, but doing is better. So we can afford more transmission at greater savings if we plan wisely. So the invitation that Sarah gave to all of us, we need all critical minds and we need perspectives, and we invite you to join us. It's time for us to get started. Thank you for joining us for this webinar.